Arratsalde-on guztioi eta eskerrik asko etorri izanagatik. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas y gracias por estar hoy aquí. La Bienal Internacional de Arquitectura de Euskadi, MUGAK, que impulsamos desde el Departamento de Vivienda y Agenda Urbana del Gobierno Vasco, busca acercar la arquitectura y el pensamiento arquitectónico al conjunto de la ciudadanía y a todos los públicos. En esta quinta edición, que arrancó el pasado 9 de octubre y cuyo lema es Castillos en el aire o cómo construir la utopía hoy, tenemos el placer y diría que también el honor de recibir a Sir Peter Cook, una de las grandes figuras de la arquitectura contemporánea, cuyo trabajo ha inspirado mucho más allá de la arquitectura a varias generaciones de creadoras y creadores desde sus inicios con los legendarios archigram, que, si me lo permiten, en mi opinión, son a la arquitectura contemporánea lo que los Beatles a la música popular. Pero no, poco importa mi opinión. Mejor les dejo con María Arana, comisaria de la quinta edición de la Bienal, que les explicará mucho mejor que yo quién es Peter Cook y por qué queríamos que estuviera hoy aquí con todos ustedes. Gracias por acompañarnos y gracias también a Donostia Cultura y al Ayuntamiento de San Sebastián por su colaboración y por dejarnos este bello lugar. Itzaldiaz gozatea espero dut, eskerrik asko guztioi.
Bueno, arratsaldeon guztioi. Segundo bat emango idazue, ezer esasteko. Oso pozik gaude egun honetan eta oso eskertuak gaude egun honetan, oso pozik sentitzen gara gaur. Hemen Sir Peter Cook gure gonbidapena onartu eta Donostiara etorri delako. Sir Peter Cook, we are very happy to host you at the MUGAK Bienal. And we appreciate the effort you made to be with us on this special day for you. Hasi aurretik, eskerrak eman nahi dizkiot Eusko Jaurlaritzari, etxebizitza eta hiri agenda sailburuari, eta bereziki etxebizitza eta arkitektura zuzendariari. Berak bere promozioa izan delako, edo berak izan zuelako Bienala aurrera egiteko, egite horrek. Mila esker ere, Donostiko udalari, Gipuzkoako Foru Aldundiari, eta bereziki Donostia Kulturako zuzendaria den Jaime Otamendiri, ze betidanik gurekin oso elkarlan zeia izan duelako. Eskerrik asko baita ere Abik Klusterrari, Euskadiko Arkitektura Institutuari, Angela Zozaia eta Miguel Bakerori esposaketa eta Bienalaren produkzioa aurrera eraman dutelako. Eta baita, Bienalean parte hartu duzuen erakunde, eskola, arkitektura eskola, instituzio eta profesional guztiak ere agurtu nahiko nituzke. Beraz, mila esker guztioi. MUGAK Bienalak galdera deserosoak, eztabaida ausartak eta etorkizun posibleak irudikatzeko beharrezkoak ditugun espekulazioak sustatu nahi ditu. Konfiantza eta askatasun esparru bat bermatuz. Horregaitik, Bienala ez da erakusketa programa hutsa izatera mugatzen. Baizik eta hausnarketa sustatzen duen, inertziei aurre egiten dion eta irudimen partekatua estimulatzen duen kultura tresna bihurtu da. Bienal honen izenburuak, gazteluak airean, Lewis Mumford historialari eta urbanistak 1922an Historia de las Utopias liburuan egindako aipamenari egiten dio erreferentzia. Non esaten zuen, une hartako zeregin garrantzitsuena gazteluak airean eraikitzea zela. Mumford sostiene que la historia de las utopías es en cierto sentido la historia del mundo. Según él, muchas utopías nacen como rechazo al contexto social y cultural de su tiempo y presentan bajo dos tipos de naturalezas. La primera, las utopías de escape, que de alguna forma huyen de la realidad. La segunda, las utopías regenerativas, que buscan transformarla. Además, advierte sobre la peligrosa cercanía entre la distopía y la utopía realizada. Cuando el ideal se encarna, corre el riesgo de degenerar en su opuesto. Bajo esta interpretación, la exposición principal de esta Bienal se muestra en el Instituto de Arquitectura de Euskadi y nos anima a pensar que la utopía sigue siendo una herramienta crítica y poderosa, capaz de inspirar transformaciones y motivar cambios sociales, así como ofrecer un espacio de experimentación para la arquitectura. Una exposición que impulsa a repensar el sistema de relaciones sociales y su arquitectura. Según Mumford, las utopías de evasión ofrecen un refugio imaginario ante las contradicciones del presente y funcionan como válvulas de escape. Dentro de la sala asociada a estas utopías de escape encontramos dos proyectos de Sir Peter Cook. En 1961, Peter Cook y David Green, recién licenciados en arquitectura, publicaron un folleto de protesta como reacción a las ideas conservadoras de las revistas de arquitectura de la época, que se mantenían al margen de las prácticas experimentales. Sir Peter Cook fue redactor jefe de Archigran desde 1961 a 1970 y representa un optimismo radical en la arquitectura. Este optimismo no se basa en un idealismo ingenuo, sino en la creencia práctica y esperanzada de que la arquitectura puede mejorar la vida de las personas. Su trabajo rechaza la arquitectura tradicional y rígida y apuesta por la experimentación y la integración de la tecnología y la cultura para crear nuevas formas de habitar. Para Cook, la arquitectura no es solo construcción, sino también es un medio para expresar ideas a través de manifiestos gráficos y dibujos difundidos mediante medios masivos como revistas y exposiciones. Estos dibujos son la forma de convertir la arquitectura en un mensaje accesible y provocador. Con esta estrategia, Peter Cook transforma la arquitectura en una herramienta de comunicación masiva e invita a imaginar futuros y a innovar en la relación entre espacio, tecnología y sociedad. Cook defendía que la arquitectura debía tener una dimensión teatral y emocional para influir y sentir en el comportamiento de las personas, utilizando los medios de comunicación como vehículo para expandir estas ideas a un público muy amplio, haciendo que la arquitectura fuese más que edificios, un verdadero manifiesto cultural y social, objetivo que comparte también la Bienal MUGAK. Sir Peter Cook es uno de los arquitectos más influyentes del pensamiento radical de la segunda mitad del siglo XX. Su trayectoria ha sido reconocida con galardones como la Medalla de Oro de Riva, el Premio Stirling y la distinción de la Academia de las Artes y de las Letras de Francia. En 2007 fue nombrado caballero por la reina Isabel II por sus aportes a la arquitectura y la enseñanza. Demos entonces la bienvenida al señor Cook. Cook ha tenido la gentileza de preparar una presentación, una conferencia para nosotros. Y después de su conferencia vamos a tener a Sofía Leka Angelopoulos, que es redactora jefe de Design Boom, que es la primera revista cultural y digital del mundo. Fundada en 1999, Design Boom publica las últimas noticias, proyectos y cuestiones clave en arte, arquitectura, diseño y tecnología, con un enfoque en aquellos temas que enriquecen el diálogo entre los profesionales creativos, la industria y la sociedad. Demos, pues, una cálida bienvenida al Sir Peter Cook, que está con nosotros aquí. Aplaudámonos. Sir Peter, welcome to us.
Thank you. Oh, is it going to stay on like that all the time? Hello. Nice to be in your beautiful town, as they always say, but it really is a beautiful town. My wife had been here before, but I'd never been, and it was a sort of mythology, but it's much better than I expected, even if we feel like we're just more tourists that are passing through, but it's a sort of posh, funky town. Anyway, you know the town. This word, I think in translation, it's picante arquitectura, or something like that. Piquant is a word I've never used before in the lecture. The lecture's it's a new lecture. So I thought this quality of the piquancy is a special one. I think it's the right word, and maybe what I'm really referring to is situations that are frequent, but it will emerge. I can't see the screen, so I'm going to do this so that I can see what I'm talking about. Oh, that's good. Aha. Yes, there we are. Motivation, Bekannte Motivation, whatever. And so when I was young, I'm sort of, the first few slides, I'm introducing myself, in case you didn't know. When I was young, I did this thing called Plug-in City. There's another drawing of it in the exhibition, as you know. This was the first drawing. And the other drawing in the exhibition was done about a year later. And I will come to explain the significance of that when I get to it. This is the middle-aged peacock. I think there's still too many lights up there, if I may say so. You'll see a better picture if you can kill them a bit. Anyway, this is a project for Berlin. I had by that time got to know Berlin quite well, and it was an invitation to do an exhibition alongside a lot of other famous names, and I spent about half a year making this strange project, which would be a metamorphic project. That's to say, the parts of it would change during the process, as was the Plug-in City. And I was interested in all sorts of strange overtones that struck me about the Berlin of that time, which is largely to do with its sinister nature. Drawing sinisterism is very difficult. So you can only make a series of constructs which suggest that all is not normal and usual. And I'm always fascinated by the overtones of a town, not just what you see, but what you sniff, what you get from meeting the people, what you get from funny little sort of incidents. And then this is, of course, the building that I'm most known with. The late Colin Fournier also is the co-author, and this is still in very good condition. I can report from fairly recently that they love it, they look after it, and it's a strange beast. And there again, I already knew the city before we made the competition, and I got to know it, of course, much better later. And it's a town that is in itself more than eclectic. It's a town which also has a certain funky quality. And then this is just taken a few weeks ago, standing with my wife in the one building that I've made in London, which of course they've taken away, and hopefully will be rebuilt somewhere else. More of that a bit later. Also, just to introduce myself, I've not done this before, but I thought I would show the sort of architecture that I liked. On the top left, Clarida Testa's bank building in Buenos Aires, which I'd admired as a student, and then was lucky enough 4 or 5 times to visit the first time with the architect himself. On the right, the work of my friends and colleagues, Coop Himmelbau, I think their finest moment in the first district of Vienna, where the bird landed, and I think it took them 500 drawings to make it, and a nervous breakdown on the part of the job architect. I know, I've been there with him. On the right, a very curious building, again in Berlin, by Ludwig Leo, the Umlauftank, which is a hydraulics building in the university, a very strange thing. I had, as a student, been very interested in Russian constructivism, and in particular in the drawings of Chernikov. And just at the point when I was beginning to be disinterested in that, I saw this building in Berlin in about 1971, and I thought, my God, constructivism lives. And this makes a point, because I think that often architecture that can be dismissed as something eccentric in the history books or art, when you see it lives, you're renewed in energy, and you say, yes, it is possible. And of course, our local fave in London, a building that's now probably 150 years old, still the best high-tech building in Northern Europe, which of course is Turner's Palm House at Kew. So, architecture is, as they say in the great quotation, firmness, commodity, and delight. And maybe, and I'm suggesting that extending this term delight is the notion of piquancy, something that is a little extra that has to come out of the delight. And so my first territory of piquancy is a wish dream for many, many years, the dream of a three-dimensional city. The examples here, of course, is the diagonal system of escalators that is in Hong Kong, which I've been up and down a few times, reaching various striations of the city as it moves up the mountain on Hong Kong Island, and of course the Barcelona example near the Güell Park. A fairly recent drawing, it's about four years old now, this drawing, where I'm also suggesting that the city doesn't exist only on the ground, although it has a very curious, idiosyncratic ground, but also exists into itself. Some shades of the plug-in city you might notice, but also other things where the capsules have started to disintegrate, where there are layers and obfuscations, and that I'll come back onto that point a bit later. And a very recent drawing, which I'm not sure about, it just is a drawing that I sort of started in one corner until I reached the other corner, and then it was more or less finished. It's really a sort of collage, though it is not technically a collage. It's a series of parts that are grasping on to some kind of three-dimensional presence and take on a number of different drifts. I think the parts that fragment the more ordered parts are the interesting ones, where I had this tendency, once I've set up a system, to try to dismember it up to the point of disintegration, up to the point of self-destruction. This always interests me. And a drawing done as a preliminary to some of the work, as you may know, that I and my friends have been doing in the background to this extraordinary and tiresome and weird and probably never going to really happen project in the desert, the Neom City, which has paid the grocery bills for some time. But anyhow, this is a drawing that I just did myself, indicating the notion again of the three-dimensional city and three-dimensional connectivity, and then vast swathes of housing between. And to the plug-in city, what I must say about this drawing, the one which is in your exhibition, is that it was done a year later than the first drawing, and in a period when I had not made a drawing for nearly a year, because I had started teaching. I'd started teaching at the Architectural Association, and for various reasons, my boss had a nervous breakdown, and suddenly I was in charge of the whole diploma year at the world's most arrogant, picky, and probably sophisticated school at that time. And I was I was younger than some of the students. I was only a bit older than most of them. And it was a baptism by fire. I've done a lot of teaching since then, but it was extraordinary. I just couldn't draw. I mean, I was so exhausted, I couldn't draw. Nothing came out. I just went to bed. And but then there was the summer. And suddenly, all this discussion, all this working through other people's processes of thought, all their paranoias and all their funny ways and so on and so on and so on. I thought I'd been a smart cookie, but I became, I suppose, an armchair psychiatrist in the process of teaching these guys. And yet, of course, what had happened was that the plug-in city ideas had frozen in my head for nearly a year and then came bursting out in this drawing. And it raises the issue to what extent, but there's not time to discuss it, but to what extent the teaching activity, the interlocutory state of teaching, feeds or does not feed the tectonic part of the brain, to be discussed at length, probably not this evening. And then sometimes the notion of the three-dimensional city just concentrates upon a particular issue. What if the three-dimensional city was a series of tables with vegetation and a lot of air? In other words, instead of filling it up, you place it in the sky, and the air becomes the three-dimensional city, so to speak. And this is some of the work done for NEOM about 3 years ago maybe, where the propositions had been made for us that there would be these two channels. And in our interpretation, you have a hot side of the shaft and a cool side. You have a very bubbly buildings on one side and very cool, smooth buildings on the other side, playing off against each other. And the three, even when I'm attempting to do something here, which was actually attempting to discuss the idea of the garden city, I find myself inevitably three-dimensionalizing it, of not keeping all the things on the ground, but starting to fly them up into a three-dimensional situation. This is a funny drawing, and I put it in as a sort of maybe to confuse more than anything else. It was a magazine cover, and it was to illustrate the almost terrifying nature of the city. This sort of weird, scary, busy, funky, strange place. So funky it's not there. And a more recent drawing where one goes back to the proposition that perhaps the city can be three-dimensional, but can almost be a forest on the top, housing in the middle, and industry at the bottom, if that could ever be maneuvered. And it's a simple drawing, with a ship doing something and a tree doing something. And a very recent drawing, this is about a week and a half old, where I was primarily interested in showing the possible variety of busyness of facades, that you could have facades made of almost anything, jumbled together like a bag of sweets. But I find also surreptitiously, I'm still somewhere lurking there, is this notion of it being a three-dimensional city, that there would be connectivity and activity. And even again, a bit like the previous drawing, putting the garden on the top. Actually, here it's a sandwich between a garden at the top and a garden at the bottom, and then the three-dimensional city existing in between the two. The temptation of the veiled presence. I don't know how much with this funny lighting here. You can see the right hand, the girl with the veil, the lady with the veil. And I'm fascinated by things that are not seen full frontally, but are actually partly obfuscated. The old lady looking through the net curtain at the passers-by is another slide I lost somewhere, but I like very much the notion that you see between. You don't, and even the buildings would have layers of veiling, and the activity within the building would be veiled, that there's mystery. I suppose, and this is a drawing that also comes on from that, where the veils become much more extant. And again, another theme lasting back to the very early days in a way, which is what do you do with the capsule? And here, the capsules have become almost fruit-like objects, layered and complex, not disintegrating as they were in the red drawing, but still not just a sort of preformed bulb. And in a way that seemed to me to work well with the notion of layering and veiling, and it's not, this is the least architectural drawing of anything in the lecture, perhaps because it doesn't actually, the stairs don't lead anywhere, and it's more or less a visualization, if you like. A very recent drawing here, I'm not sure what to say. When they're very recent drawings, sometimes you don't quite know what to say. It's actually a beach. It's a beach which is a spa, and it's a spa which has some drone-like capsules which are hanging territories, veiled territories of steam and water, and some of the people are still using the beach in the normal way. Here again, the veiling is within a stated carcass. There's a stated carcass of building, and then on close inspection you see that some of the hidden building is just behind the veiled carcass. Some pieces of the building are actually piercing out. So here it's a sort of edge game where some elements are actually forcing their way through the veil, and then it's being probed from afar at the same time. And another drawing, which is not a drawing, a rendition, which is again talking about the veiled building. And in the small pavilion, which some of you may have seen in the park in London this summer, the notion was to partially hide the interior contents. And in certain photographs, again, you get this slight feeling of the veil. Or projects where we deliberately make the interior part a shadowy form within. This is a competition project for a puppet theatre. Unsuccessful competition, I might say. This trigger is a bit strange. And another competition project where it's not exactly a veil, but it's a peep show. That the museum inside exposes itself in small slivers of cut. Small slivers, which in reality would be about that kind of size. And at night you would see, through the lights, you'd see people's feet walking around inside it. So that it's a peep show rather than a veil, but some of the same thinking is in there. Now, there's another category which I find myself intrigued by just now, and this is the reference on the right is to, something that you get in many, many European giant parks with these special objects. This happens to be somewhere called Stourhead in the southwest of England. Oh. And a building that I did a few years ago for an arts university in Bournemouth is an object. It's in a fairly tight-packed campus, but it's on its own little patch of space, and it bears no resemblance to any of the other buildings in the campus. It's the opposite of contextual, if you like. It is its own thing. It also plays that same game, by the way, in the lit lower strip there. You can see people's feet walking about inside it, but you can't see the people. And as they look through the north light, which is after it's a drawing studio, as they look through the north light, they can see the trees, but they can't see the people outside. It's a very simple building, playing with light largely, and with the basics of the tradition of the art studio. And another project for the Middle East, which is a house which uses an interior that uses a combination of virtual reality and reality. It's a sort of effectively a private theatre with the house part at the back of the nose. And it's very deliberately in a location that is totally isolated. Or here, for the eastern part of England, a flat territory with the sea at the end, an isolated small object amongst its own little vegetation forming part of in a way, forming part of the structure. Or a cabin, again capsule derivative, but which by this time has become very deliberately ramshackle, or sort of random and slightly hairy, so almost something from the prairie, but not actually from the prairie. And back to the pavilion as constructed, sitting in this royal park on its own. Or perhaps it could be one of several. And this is, in this drawing, it's a reference also to a very old project, the Instant City. So the balloons hanging with small objects on the ground is a reference back sort of 40 or more years before, when the notion of small temporary buildings moving was a notion. I didn't know it would take so long to get to build one. And this is sort of symbolic. It's the last night of the pavilion. The next day it was deconstructed. So there's a certain piquancy to the notion of the last night of the building, which was there for 3 months and then dies away. This is a very sluggish machine. Okay, the insidious charm of vegetation. This is a picture from, actually not taken by me, it's much better than one I could take. It's a picture of the 18th century garden architecture that was made actually by Italian gardeners in Middle Germany, in Schwetzingen, which is near Mannheim. And we see there at the end a trompe l'oeil painting, which is lit by a very special sort of device. And then, so that is an artificial thing mixed in with these elaborate trellises where the vegetation has to make the architecture together with the trellis. And I've been fascinated by this notion of the trellis and the condition or the kind of the possibility of vegetation as a constituent part of architecture, not as something disintegrative from it. And here, a single piece of a project I call Veg House, where the vegetation starts to inculcate itself in amongst the normally built form. And sometimes this, I'm fascinated and respond. This is when I was in Houston long time ago as a guest professor, and I was fascinated, as you can see in the photograph, by the fact that large swathes of Houston are covered in trees, and all you get, the city is there, 2 floors high, underneath the trees. And I developed that idea, also interested in the idea of the guided vehicle, but that's by the way, and suggested an extension of Houston myself, which I call Super Houston, where this continuation of these two-story buildings would be articulated by darts of building running across the freeway that would identify where you were. I realized that much later, only recently, has there been a building made in Los Angeles on the boulevard, where it is both a building and a billboard. And this was anticipating that, the notion of the building as a billboard. Back to vegetation at close scale, this is part of a project for a wall building. And I became very interested in the way even that the wall could be treated and rasped and cut, and so that the vegetation and the notion of the water dripping and the grain of the building could be mixed together in, again, a kind of collage, if you like, of vegetation and substance. And then, of course, the occasional window that pierces through this system. or this, which was a very complex drawing, which is a sort of game I played with myself as to whether what you see as a vegetated thing is actually an organized form or not. So some of the pieces look like architecture, and in fact are architecture. Some have the kind of systematics of architecture, but look like vegetation. And quite a lot of the drawing is, is deliberately a contradiction. In the sense, you set yourself that, is it a building? Is it a vegetation? Is it vegetation following the form of a building? Is it some kind of hybrid? Or is it just vegetation? And in a recent project, the notion of the vegetation happening under the building intrigues me. This is a very steep site in the back of Los Angeles, which we hope this will get built, actually. And it's so steep that you really can't walk up and down it. You can walk over it, so to speak, from the top, and yet you still want to have gardening happening. Or here, a city which very much, it's a little bit of overtone. You have this in this city here, where you have the mountain coming down in amongst the city. And then deliberately one has further quotations of vegetation so that you never know whether the vegetation never stops. It happens, if you like, heroically up the hill. But it all so happens in the small scale dribble. There's a dribble down of vegetation. Or, of course, the notion that this can be worked back into a tectonic system, partially vegetation, partially normal tectonics from the section you see, and some which is perhaps artificial vegetation, which raises the eyebrow in the purist. My God, are you talking about plastic vegetables? Maybe I am. This is really a kind of challenge, in a way, challenge to myself. Oh, I'm causing an electronic. And I have to read, is color analogous to chatter? Chitter-chatter, color. And architects who avoidance of color, is it a form of arrogance? If you're a proper good architect, you don't colored things. Or are they squeamish? Are they timid? Sort of challenge. This thing's not working very well. Okay. I was many years ago, when I was a very young student, fascinated by Brazil, by the notion of Brazil, by the pictures I saw at the time. I was only a second-year student. I saw the first time illustrations of Roberto Burle Marx's gardens. I thought they were unbelievable. And, you know, it was the period of a famous, actually Portuguese Brazilian called Carmen Miranda, who always wore these hats. And then, of course, there's Niemeyer himself. And so many years later, having been a few times to Brazil, I made a suggestion of what I thought was a Brazilian architecture, which has overtones that plug in amongst, but basically it is what we loosely call Brasiliana. Here, the color is pieces of, again, layers of a commercial building in a sort of commercial street, but you will notice that the sky is not a sky, it's actually an enclosure. And in a sense, it's a continuation of the conversation started by Buckminster Fuller all those years ago, where he suggested a dome over New York. Once you put a protected condition, you can have buildings that are quite flimsy. They don't have to deal with the weather, and they can deal with being a series of loose surfaces, replaceable surfaces. Or here, as it says in the caption, I'm looking again at the old proposition of the columnated hall, and then doing very naughty things into it, deliberately. Growy's, a contradictory piece of building. And again, my friends, the flying capsules. The This, by the way, that, by the way, I'm not allowed to, I can't press it backwards apparently. But if you remember this yellow thing, this is the cover of my new book, which will be out on March the 5th. And talks in length about some of these drawings. Or can colored architecture be the single, simple, colored object? What happens to a simple, single, colored object? What happens to a sunshine corner? This is our building in Vienna, the law faculty, and a piece of it, which I always call the sunshine corner. We were delighted, as guys originally from the seaside, to go to Vienna, which has a lot of cold, white. It's a beautiful city, but full of white and grey buildings, and the wind howls down. I know Vienna very well, and I know it can get really, really cold in that town. And they put these grey buildings, makes you feel even more cold. So we put a sunshine building in there. So that within the colour, you can have chatter. And I've never used this thought before. It's the first time I've used it in the lectures. It's an analogy between colour and chatter. In an old English city called Norwich, where I've been doing some things lately, we suggest that instead of just using stone within stone, you could use colour within stone. And what would happen? This town also can have dark, grey, misty. It's in the misty fenlands of England. It can be very damp. And again, you need colour. And so here we are inside a coloured object with chatter. And back to the beach, colour and chatter. Or in a project for Albania, the use of very bright colour. And again, in the new drawing, the chatter, and the colour. It intrigues me, this analogy. But I can do a white building. Inside that blue building is a very white space. It's not that I can't do white building. It's not a calm building, it's a white building, if you want white. Funny things in funny places intrigue me. This is a funny old little English thing somewhere in Suffolk. It's a gatehouse. God knows why it's like that. And it just sits there in free space. And so again, back to that garden drawing, the odd thing in free space intrigues me. And in the building that we built in Australia, the architecture school, it's symbolic that we provided the furniture and we allowed then the students to configure the furniture any way we gave big spaces and they could configure the furniture. The furniture hinted at certain sort of configurations, but the whole thing is that it's open-ended in a sense. Also, excuse me to show you the Australian building. The odd things in odd places. Here's a newish megastructure where small industrial elements, small sort of backyard industry, is placed in a kind of rack, up above, away from the ground. And the artisans in the various little cabins can do their things, and it can be highly serviced from the rail system. Or the notion of the village in the woods. In the UK, we have a severe housing problem, and one of the solutions that's being adopted is to take small villages and small towns and stick pieces of town on the edge of them. Usually they're horrendous. I mean, you have a perfectly agreeable village, and then there's this chunk of sort of suburbia that's added on with these terrible English noddy houses. I said, why not go back to the tradition of the tower poking out of the woods, except the tower now is a housing tower, and it pokes out of the woods. You can put a lot of people in there, and they can have a bus stop at the corner, and up and away. Or the notion of the odd object in an odd place. We look out of this serviced cave with its vegetation, possibly artificial vegetation or induced vegetation. We look out of the cave onto a kind of beach, but is it a beach? It's a constructed beach. And we look across to an island where we can see more of these caves and the product of these beaches. I'm trying to find another architectural balance here between the vegetated form and the role of the edge, the role of the beach or the rim as a contrast to it. Or back to the Los Angeles house where the object is sitting perched. You're not so much talking now about the vegetation, but the fact that the object is perched in a very curious place. There shouldn't be a building there, but it's placed. Actually, this is a little bit in the Los Angeles tradition, because if you poke around the Hollywood Hills in particular, you do find a number of houses here and there that fly out into the nowhere by being, in fact, a deck. Mine is just a bit more of an exaggerated version, if you like. Or do you take these strange objects that should, in fact, be totally isolated and start to put them together? I'm interested in this because I'm currently reworking the pavilion as part of a village. You saw in an early slide where it starts to become a bubble village. And this is a complex drawing which is also concerned with objects in the middle of the woods, so it refers back to that tower, objects on the edge of forests, also the notion of the hostile landscape in contradistinction to the friendly landscape. Or odd pieces of city that find themselves climbing up the tower. The tower absorbs that colored city and makes different events happen, quite rhetorical events, not just a little bit of planting, but dance halls and swimming pools and gardens and parks and things occurring in between the different parts of the building. And here, combinations of capsules in odd positions, but coming together as a composition in a sense, in a way. I'm interested in skins. And the oddity of skins. In the Graz building, we were allowed to do a little bit of experimentation until they found we were spending too much money, where we played with layered skins. Not just one skin, but 2 or 3 layers of skin. In this drawing for a tower for Highbury Corner, there's the total tower on the left, and if we look at the sort of sub-elements, we see the ground is very relatively solid and related to the tradition of London's red brick, if you like, and then it starts to melt into fairly regular flat or static system. As it moves up to the top of the tower, the system starts to have conditions that are able to oscillate, so that strange things happening in strange conditions again. Veils. I'm interested here in this drawing that the foreground is actually much more interesting architecture than the city that lies behind. You can see a fairly ordinary, American city sitting behind, but the foreground, this leafy, semi-mechanized, semi-vegetated condition is actually another architecture through which you see the boring architecture. And so I'm interested in these various combinations of color and odd placement. So there's also the question of architecture as an escape, or perhaps you might say, somebody here might say, oh, it's you who's doing the escaping. Are you escaping from architecture? But how much are we willing to leave the city behind us? If you're rich and powerful and weird, you can do, the castle in Bavaria. You can have an apparently vegetated condition, maybe a dramatic one in this case, but if you look carefully, the architecture is infiltrating it, is inserted. It may even be, if you look very carefully at the drawing, parts of it may be sways of window actually coming down the side of the hill. Is it a building? Certainly quite a lot of it is, but at first sight it's a landscape. Another example here where the buildings are perched into the landscape. Another example here where the building, a very dramatic landscape because it's fast-moving mountain streams and then a piece of flat land towards the sea. And all the time I'm interested in these slivers of building appearing, some of them heroically, some of them almost totally insidiously. You almost can't notice that they're there. I'm very interested in the degree of infiltration. And so finally, the piquances are a condition, I think, that I'm really interested in. I, of course, occasionally been able to make a building that slithers. I'm fascinated by slither. I'm fascinated, bottom left, by Schwetzingen, its meshes, slithering and meshing, and slithering and smiling. Why should not a building smile? Thank you. I moved the chair because I couldn't see what I was talking about unless normally I have a computer that's telling me what's coming up. But anyway, there we are.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. It was incredibly interesting to see all the way you think and all the work you've done.
Yeah. Good.
So we've seen projects of yours that have been built, but also a lot of them that were never realized. And in alignment with the Bienal's theme of castles in the air and how it signifies ideas and hopes or plans that may never be carried out, why do you think it's important to still imagine castles in the air
Well, I don't know where they are castles in the air. I mean, I think that I was interviewed this morning and I made great play on the fact that I don't really agree with the idea of utopianism. I think utopianism is something else. I'm very interested in the issues I showed, which is to do with conditions and subtleties. Some of the things are, there's one drawing, and I drew attention to this, that was almost totally abstract. It wasn't like an abstract drawing, but it was something, it's not suggesting an arrangement of parts. Most of even the sort of weirder things or imaginative things have an arrangement of parts, and there's also going through my mind that they would be arranged. So when I show a piece of hillside with things inserted in it, I have, I hope, a fairly clear idea of the size of it and how you would access it and what you would make it from. I don't think there's any dividing line And I will re-quote something I've quoted so many times before, but it involves name dropping, because it involves Rem Koolhaas, who used to live near me. And we were chatting in the street one day, and we were going through all the people we remembered at the Architectural Association who had been dismissed, including ourselves, by the way, as drawers, drawing people who made these pie-in-the-sky schemes. And then we listed there were 20 of them, including ourselves, who had built. We said, so what do they do now? It was very comfortable if you say, there's utopia, there's sort of dreams, and there's proper building. And then you start, and I like the fact that, I think had something like Graz been shown as a drawing, people say, yes, but it's never. Then it's there. You can walk inside it and go have a pee inside it and put an exhibition inside it and anything. It's a building like buildings are. Now, you can say that there are certain parts of it that are very normal. Mm-hmm. But there is no dividing line, and I still feel that quite vehemently. Just as it amused me to do the drawing that showed the play pavilion in London as a piece of Instant City, because you could have taken that pavilion, put it in the Instant City drawing, and say, yes, that's a piece of it. But they don't do this thing. And you do. And I'm not saying absolutely every drawing is totally 100% buildable, but it's a bloody sight more buildable than people like to give it room for. And I think the connection is important, just as I think, and I could go off at a great tangent here, but I won't, that there's a connection between the conversations you have as a teacher, which is why I made the point about that early drawing, that its degree of complexity was partly because of the complexity of the conversations that I'd had during that year. I think these things link, and you can then ask yourself, would I have done different drawings had I done more buildings? But there are quite some friends of mine who do these sort of drawings and never do any buildings. There's some people who do a lot of building and they wish to hell they'd stop and do the occasional drawing. And a few days ago I was together with some ex-students of mine who are now professors who do wonderful drawings and don't seem to want to do any building. Even their own kitchen extension was done by one of their students. Now that's a choice because they're very sophisticated and they do know about building, but they've chosen not to. So there are many layers of this conversation. But I'm really vehement about the fact that if you just dismiss it as utopian, or not dismiss it, but if you categorize it as utopian, and then say that's that and that's that, it's very, very dangerous. Because there's a whole history throughout, civilization of things that were dreams that suddenly somebody's surprised and oh, bloody hell, it's there. Mm-hmm.
In the Lewis Mumford book that has been quoted in the curatorial text of the Biennale, there is a quote that says that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at. It's actually by Oscar Wilde, and it finishes with saying, progress is the realization of utopias.
Yeah,
so in a way,
I didn't know that quote, but it's as useful as a useful quote. I'll use it myself next time.
Sometimes I feel that utopian thinking and imagining worlds that don't exist even on paper can lead to a certain kind of progress. So I wouldn't say this. Yeah,
but it's my central point, and I will labor this point, which is that I think that it is usual, not necessarily Oscar Wilde, but to say there is the utopian world, and a box is put around it, and then there's the real world. I thoroughly enjoy the business of making exhibitions, as you can see, and I thoroughly enjoy the fact that you can, in some conditions, have a picture that is quite intensely architectural, making intense architectural points. And somebody buys the picture, they stick it on their wall, so they're quite happy that it's architecture instead of a pot of flowers or a Picasso head. And then the picture, if they weren't watching, something happens down the street where that picture has become a building, because actually the drawing was about architectural ideas, and it was just another way of playing. And I'm faced with, at this present moment, I haven't got any buildings on the go. I'm still doing a lot of drawings. Half a year ago, I had one little building on the go, and the drawing stopped for a few weeks, because we had a tight program. And that happens occasionally, that when there's and it's quite interesting if we look at the few more major buildings that I've done, I have hardly any art drawings of them. Because once you get the scheme, and maybe it's competition window, once you get the scheme, there's not time to mess around doing a nice drawing. You've got to get the bloody thing out. And that's interesting to me. And there's a certain charm in working drawings, But I'm laboring the point very deliberately, because I think critics, architectural historians, many teachers, in fact, I think it's a conspiracy theory here. I think in a lot of architecture schools, the professor will say, don't look at that, it's just a utopian idea, it has nothing to do with what we can do. And I think professors are often the worst offenders, because it makes them slightly nervous. The fact that might be buildable. What do we tell the kids then?
Yeah, and yet you've seen how many architects your drawings have inspired, and what a lot of teachers might have called utopias.
Well, you become, I can say that you actually become, after sort of 50 years of teaching, you become a cynic. You meet these kids, people who were kids, in a conference, and if they're male, they have a bald head and they're rather large, and you mentally put hair back on their head and reduce the size of them. And then you remember that they did a fantastic scheme for a sort of, let's say it was a plastic windmill, just for argument's sake. And then they show you what they've done, and they're now the sort of chairman of the local society. And they show you a building that's sort of just like the guy next door, and you think, I remember that guy when he didn't have a bald head and didn't have a stomach and had fire in his eyes. And as I was saying this morning, the people, I think, the question can be, are there people still with fire in their eyes? I think the interesting thing to me now is that the people who are doing wonderful things with computational architecture and do have the fire in their eyes. They still have the fire in their eyes.
Yeah. A lot of times we see at Design Boom projects that envision worlds or concepts that are not there yet, and we really try to push for this idea of utopian optimism, actually, and the idea of really finding positivity and goal for a brighter future. And within the ongoing context of what is being imagined for a future for building on Mars or for the parallel metaverses, how do you imagine the world progressing, and do you think that optimism is more important than ever now that everything?
Oh, absolutely. There's this reiterant thing about the pandemic. The pandemic was terrible, and all that, and we know, and it was. Actually, I had quite an amusing time, because I was in the garden making a gazebo out of drilling bits of aluminum strip, and it was good weather. And I did a lot of drawings as well, so actually, but it was terrible. But it became a great excuse for gloomers. Not only are the kids supposed to be all sort of warped and didn't meet anybody, but everybody was, and then there's a sort of post-pandemic, as if, people suddenly grew cabbage ears after or something. And it's an excuse for the feeble. And I'm really probably politically totally incorrect. I have no respect for these feeble creatures that came at the butterfly generation. And it's interesting, if you go in the right places, there's now another lot coming along who seem much more like normal people, that they will sadly be left behind still sort of gloomy and wispy, but the next lot coming along behind won't have any time for that. Particularly not from the Far East, I think. I think the new architecture is coming from the Far East, not from Europe particularly. Mm-hmm. Europe's still sort of worried about itself and all that.
And are you more optimistic for the architecture that is coming?
Sorry?
Are you more optimistic for the architecture that is coming from the...
Well, I think it will be its own architecture, albeit that the most interesting Chinese architects mostly went to Harvard, but that period will develop, they'll start having their own scene. And I know that I'm sort of surrounded by Chinese in London. It happens. And you see that they're not quite so nervous, whatever we think about their autocracy.
So you mentioned a little bit about escape and what it means in the context of architecture. And actually, your works here are placed within the context of escape utopias. But when you were doing them, or now, do you feel that there is a sense of escapism in your work, or is it more a way to look at things?
There might be, but I would see that as a weakness. I think what I was referring in the escape here was more getting out of the normal urban situation. The sort of escape that I see where there are certain people around, and we know them well, who sort of never really like any... My mother was one such. I grew up with a lady who always wanted to move house because she couldn't stand being sort of fixed in a place. And that's an odd... But there are people who, dream of living in the country, and then they go in the country, and then they fall ill and they can't get to the hospital quickly enough. I mean, that's the sort of practicality. Or there are people who sort of dream of living in the city, but they don't know anybody in the city that they move to. So I think there's always this sort of uncertainty about where. And in a way, this is just something I've just suddenly thought of at this moment, which could be another conversation. In a way, of course, we could admit that the ideal condition would be the suburb, where you could opt in to being a city person, you could opt into the countryside. You could, of course, as we did in early projects, suggest that you live God knows where, and you stick a sort of artificial thing around the back of the garden, and it pretends you are wherever you might be, depending on what you project onto it, which, is another way of looking at it. But, the suburb is sort of terrible in the way that we know it, but the notion of the suburb was quite an interesting idea. That you could have the benefits, you could see a cow outside the window in one direction, you could get a bus, you could get a rapid transit to the middle of the town and go to a drinking club within a matter of minutes. It never quite happens like that. But it just occurs to me that there are many forms of utopia. There are many forms of the device directed towards a notion. I make a sort of abstracted point here, which is that people like me are in the device business. We have to also play being in the notion business, but I think that I would say that many notions can be satisfied by a rather good device and should not necessarily be dismissed. I mean, another thing that interests me, which that drawing was about, is the idea of backyard industry. That my generation, people just before it, spent a lot of time and energy getting rid of industrial installations because they were unhealthy and, they wanted to build housing or make them into a park, or usually because they want to build housing. So we had the whole thing of the brownfield site and the fact that industry existed. I mean, flying over this part of Spain last night, one looks down and there are these valleys with the sheds in them because it's valleys and there's industry. And that's fascinating. The notion you said here, is it and intriguing, because is it countryside or is it city? There's a bit of town, and then there's shed, And then there's a bit of sort of mountain, not really mountain, but hills. There's another little strip of town, then shed. Now that was intriguing because we were in our flat country land, or whether it's USA or UK or whatever, you never do it that way, you know. But the notion of how you knit a city interests me tremendously. And I think in taking industry, at least, I'm not saying it's a car building plants or anything of that scale, but a few guys making things, taking it out has been a tragedy, actually. You know, and I'm always intrigued by this Chinese chop house, you know, shop house where sort of granny is somewhere sitting at the back and somebody's selling something in the front and somebody's making something somewhere and there's somebody else. You know, is it a shop? Is it a industry? Is it family? Is it extended? I mean, it's supposed to be unhealthy and not, you know, not real. But I'm interested in these things as much so that they are not utopias, but they are conditions for which people like me, whether they're quote-unquote visionary type architects, ordinary architects, or hybrid, which I would regard myself as, but we're in the let's see how you do it business, actually. And that really interests me the most. Yeah. And I even think that some of my slightly Looney Tunes drawings are still in the look, let's see how we can do it. I think they're about, let's see how we can do it.
Yeah, there's this sense of perpetual motion, perpetual...
that we're investigators.
Yeah.
And you can investigate with a paintbrush or with a computer, or with a measuring rod or an electronic thing that said that is 43.2 meters away. We're still in the doing it business.
Fantastic. If you had one piece of advice, I mean, you have been teaching for so many years, probably you've been asked this question many times, but I think for the younger generation, it's quite interesting. For those that do want to envision and imagine things beyond the ordinary, what would it be?
Look. I always say look. And I always quote, people who know me in the front row will have heard this many times. There was a girl student at the AA many years ago, and she was doing a bus station, right? A bus station. She's very talented. So she's not a bad student, she's a very good student. And I looked at the drawing. I said, do you use the bus? She said, sure, I come in the bus every day. I said, do you remember getting off the bus? She gave me a very weird look, as I remember. She had drawn the bus station based on an American piece of information, not upon the fact that every day she used the bus. And that makes my point. And I think that with the easy availability of the internet, and I do it myself, I sit for hours on the laptop, almost as recreation, just looking up funny things. I've been looking up San Sebastian and then other towns that were mentioned at lunch, you know, just out of interest. It's so easy to sort of get received, packaged information and not enjoying what you see. I think, you know, just one day walking, well, we didn't do that much walking, had a bit of taxi as well, but just looking at this funny town here, because it's a very nice town, by the way, a posh town, but it's a funny town. The physiognomy of it is curious, you know, a bit of a mountain there and a mountain there and a bit of a bay there and something else at the back and then a bit of old town, but it's not really sort of pokey old town, it's reconstructed old town, and then there's a bit of, you know, and a posh street and another posh street there. It doesn't take long. Now, maybe I'm old and experienced and I've absorbed towns, and I lived in lots of towns as a child. So you grow up quickly picking up hints. You say, that's one of those, that's one of those. It's a bit of a variant here. I can see that there. Now I look at the map. Okay, that's what it does. Mm-hmm. And that interests me as a mechanic, but it's looking, it's to do with looking. The map comes into it at some point after you've done the looking, or to help you do the looking, but not as if I sat in the hotel room just looking at the map and then dialing up on the internet famous pictures of San Sebastian. It wouldn't work. But seeing the relationship of the houses on the cliff to how suddenly it becomes a smart town at a certain point is intriguing. And then if I had another 3 days here, one would start looking at which sort of people are in which park, where there are more tourists and less tourists, where do the tourists not go, and where is the backyard industry, because there has to be some here and there, etc., etc., etc. That's really interesting stuff. It's rich, and so the key word is look. Look, look, look. Watch how you get out of the bus if you're going to do a bus station, not what it tells you in a manual about bus stations.
That's perfect. We have to close this off, unfortunately, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. It has been incredibly insightful.
Thank you.
And, yeah, thank you.